Hello, everyone. I hope you can see us and hear us. Thank you for joining this sharing by Dr. Jamie Metzl, who is the founder and chair of this amazing network. Some people call it organization, OneShared.World. I was told that this is present in many countries around the world. And congratulations to Dr. Jamie for bringing these people all together for various noble causes and purposes, particularly in these challenging times. On behalf of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, or what we call RSIS, I'm happy to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jamie Metzl. And he will be talking about this interesting topic. Coronavirus broke the world. How can we build back better? I'm very sure all of you who are tuning in has been affected in one way or another by this COVID-19, and we think about what we should do for the future. So we have an expert here in the person of Dr. Jamie Metzl to elucidate more on all the different aspects and what are the prospects going forward. I also like to welcome our good friend, Ambassador Tommy Koh, Professor, Faculty of Law, National University of Singapore. And he is also Ambassador at Large at the Singapore Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that is. Thank you, Prof. Tommy, for honoring us with your presence. Yeah, COVID-19 has caused severe disruptions around the world. I don't think the story is over yet. Many people's way of life, jobs, and even the future of our respective societies have been very severely affected. How are we going to cope going forward? People are still talking about it, and we are experimenting with different ways of coping with this and hoping to prepare better for the coming days and months. Some people say that with this COVID-19, it demonstrates that the global community is very threatened by all kinds of new dangerous pathogens and future communicable diseases and crises of this nature will be quite common and even more severe. We do not know. Maybe after we listen to Dr. Jamie, we can have a better fix on some of these challenges. So we will leave now to Dr. Jamie Metzl for his timely and important talk. What can we do to build for a better future? Thank you, Tommy. I will pass the floor now to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kenyon. It's a very great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Dr. Jamie Metzl. Jamie is an exceptionally gifted American friend. He has had several distinguished careers in one lifetime. Let me just mention a few of them. He was a US government official, having worked in the State Department, National Security Council, the Senate Foreign Relations under Joe Biden, the candidate of the Democratic Party for president. Then he had a second career as a UN official. He was a member of the famous UN peacekeeping and peacemaking team in their successful operation in Cambodia. And he actually wrote a book on Cambodia. His third career was as the executive vice president of the Asian Society. And it was during this time that we got to know each other, worked closely together in organizing the annual Williamsburg conference. His fourth career is a very successful writer. He has reinvented himself into a world authority on bioengineering, on human genome editing. And he's often sought after as a speaker, as a commentator, both on global affairs especially on America's relations with countries in Asia and on biotechnology. His most recent book, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity, is a bestseller. And on top of all that, he's also an Ironman. I don't know. So here's a combination of brains and brawn. So with those words, I'd like to now ask Jamie to speak to us.
Well, thank you so much, Tommy, and thank you so much, Kenyon. It's really just a tremendous pleasure and an honor for me to be here with both of you and with the amazing colleagues and the community around RSIS and NTU. As Tommy said, I've been a friend of both Kenyon and Tommy for at least 15 years, since we all worked very closely together. I've visited NTU campus multiple times and have met with students, and I'm a big fan of Singapore. And if I had to say, well, what is it about Ambassador Ong Kenyon and Ambassador Tommy Ko? What do their lives represent, and why I'm so honored to be here? It's they represent the idea of people and communities and countries coming together to solve big problems. I'm sure most of the people here already know that Tommy was one of the big champions of the law of the sea, and Ong Kenyon, as Secretary General of ASEAN, worked tirelessly to bring people and countries together in times of crisis. And that's what we're in right now, this kind of this moment of crisis where we have different paths ahead of us. And one path is the path that Tommy and Kenyon represent, which is the path of doing the hard work and coming together and finding common ground. And there's another path that's a much worse path, and we're seeing it play out around the region and around the world. And that is the path of nationalism, of destruction, of not trying to find common ground, but to use these moments of crisis to divide people and seek advantage and harmful opportunity. And that's what this moment is all about. That's why having conversations like this aren't just a way for all of us to be entertained at a time of crisis when many of us are home. It's a way of bringing our voices together to really imagine the kind of world that we would like to live in, and then begin laying the foundations for that world. And I'm also honored that RSIS and NTU is based in Singapore. And I have I stopped counting after 40 or 50 visits to Singapore. Singapore is just an absolutely incredible country. And what Singapore has done nationally, bringing different communities together, and it's really remarkable what's happened. It's not perfect. What Singapore has done, bringing countries together as a founding member of ASEAN and all of the ASEAN plus communities, Singapore is always in the middle of these efforts. And now in the context of this pandemic, Singapore, in a very smart way, learned the lessons of SARS, which is why Singapore was ready, again, not perfect, but to take important steps in the early days of the pandemic. I know for me, when I was in college, I did a junior year abroad. And in those days, the Lee Kuan Yew scholars were only at Cambridge. Now they're all over the place. But in those days, we had all of these Singaporean superstars who were only in Cambridge for obvious reasons. And I had a lot of debates with them in those days about governance and different forms of organization. And I think right now what we're seeing at this stress moment for the world is that we all have strengths and weaknesses, but all of those strengths and weaknesses are amplified. Certainly in Singapore, where, as I said, you've done a great job on COVID, but the virus is kind of pointing a finger at all of us. And when we have, as you have in Singapore, these different living conditions for people of different backgrounds, the virus points its finger and identifies it's not just those vulnerabilities, it's all of our vulnerabilities, because that's what this pandemic is showing us, that we're all connected. And certainly here in the United States, that the virus is in a very unfortunate and sad and discouraging and dispiriting way. It's pointing at our own shortcomings, and its shortcomings of inequality, of differential health outcomes, of a healthcare system that's not able to bear this burden. And what we're seeing at this moment of vulnerability is we're seeing ourselves in the mirror. We're seeing the best of ourselves, of people who are coming together and rallying and finding ways to support each other. And we're seeing the worst of ourselves, of people who are retreating behind walls or imagining that their own safety and well-being isn't connected to the safety and health and well-being of everybody else, not just in our communities and countries, but in the world. And as our world experiences this global crisis, it's easy to imagine an alternative history. And it's not crazy to say, well, what could have happened in a different world when there was the first indication of the pathogenic outbreak in Wuhan last year? And in that world, China would have immediately done everything it could to publicize the problem and suppress it. We would have had a World Health Organization that had the capacity and the resources and the mandate to immediately do its own investigation and rally an international response to the pandemic. And we would have had countries around the world like the United States, and frankly, like the United States did in the past with Ebola and other crises, that are asking the question, what can we do to help? And that wasn't the world that we experienced. And because of that, we have so many hundreds of thousands of people who are dead unnecessarily, avoidably. We have millions of people who've been infected by the pandemic. And in my view, the worst is yet to come. Like, we haven't turned the corner. So for me, when I see something that didn't go well, I need to ask the question, well, why is it? Because I think that's how we get to the bottom, not of pointing fingers, but of actually solving problems. We have to travel up the stream of why and really just be honest about the shortcomings that we see. And there are lots of fingers to point. The pandemic started in China. There are still many questions. I've been very public in asking those questions about the origins of the outbreak, whether it was a naturally occurring jump, or whether some kind of leak from one of the Chinese, the Wuhan virology institutes. We don't know the answer to that question, but we need to. We know that particularly the local authorities in Wuhan were extremely aggressive in trying to suppress information about the outbreak, including by disinfecting the market, destroying evidence, silencing many of the early whistleblowers, and that the World Health Organization team that had wanted to come to China to do an urgent investigation was held outside of China for nearly a month. And those were really critically important first weeks. And we have to say, well, why is it that this potentially small pathogenic outbreak became big? The first finger that we must point, not because we're bad people, but because we have to get to the bottom of the problem so that it doesn't happen again, must be at China. And China has learned a lot, certainly since the experience of SARS, but there was something that was deeper. It had to do with the reward mechanism for local and national authorities, that had to do with the free flow or the lack of free flow of information, with the empowerment of individuals to talk about things that may contradict official narratives. So we have to start there. But certainly if we only point fingers at China, which some people like President Trump seem to want to do, we're going to miss the story, because Taiwan had all the information that the United States had, probably even a little bit less because its lack of representation in the World Health Assembly. But in late December of last year, Taiwan sounded its alarm. It helps that it has an epidemiologist as its vice president, but Taiwan, other countries like Singapore, New Zealand, others, sprung into action with plans that they had been developing. And so while we must point fingers at China, we in the United States must point fingers at ourselves, because 7 people have died of COVID in Taiwan, and we are nearing 200,000 people who've died from COVID here in the United States. And the third, I mean, there are lots of places to look, but the third place where we need to look is the World Health Organization itself. I am a member of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, and I'm a very, very big fan of the WHO. If we didn't have the WHO, we would have to create the WHO, and we wouldn't have all of the expertise and all of the history that we've developed over decades. But could the WHO have done a better job of challenging the information it was being provided by China early on? Yes, even by the WHO's admission. Could the WHO, when its investigators were not being allowed to go to China, raise the alarm a little bit more? Probably yes. But I'm hesitant about being overly critical of the WHO, because my fundamental critique of the WHO has nothing to do with the staff of the WHO or Dr. Tedros or anybody who works at the WHO. The critique of the WHO is the critique of us. We, the countries of the world who created the WHO, didn't allow it to have the kind of global surveillance network that it needs, because many countries, including the United States, didn't want to have that kind of obtrusive surveillance. We, the countries of the world, didn't create an automatic mechanism where WHO investigators could immediately fly to a hotspot in a moment's notice, because we didn't want to have that, the openness to that violation of our national sovereignty. And so when push came to shove, the WHO by design did not have the tools that it needed to do the job that we needed it to do. But to ask that question of why, and again, I talked about traveling up the stream of whys, we actually have to go back in history to 1648 and the Peace of Westphalia, as Tommy knows, which ended the 30 Years' War and established our concept, our modern concept of the sovereign state. And that actually was a big improvement. I mean, a third of everyone in Europe had died in the 30 Years' War, so it wasn't like that was some kind of golden age. But we were so effective in creating a world of sovereign states that we created a new problem of these sovereign states jockeying with each other. And when we experienced that kind of conflict through 2 world wars, we finally came to our senses and realized that a world of just jockeying nation states was a world that was destined to continually reach terrible destruction through wars. And that was why some incredibly brilliant people from all over the world, led by the United States, but certainly not only the United States, created not just the United Nations, but the whole network of international organizations that over time grew to include the Bretton Woods organizations, the EU, ASEAN. Everything comes from that same instinct that just a world of competing nation states is a world that's doomed to failure. And there is an idealized history of that post-war world, and maybe I have it a little bit as an American and as the son myself of a refugee. But had Japan or Germany won the Second World War, we wouldn't have had the kind of international organizations, the kind of United Nations that we have. It was because the United States and the Allies won with a new vision that had been articulated in 1941 through the Four Freedoms and the Atlantic Charter, that we could begin laying the foundations of this new order. And it wasn't that it replaced nation states, but it was an overlay, an essential overlay that had international institutions, that had international law, which started small, but then it grew and extended over time. And people like Tommy and Kenyon were part of those negotiations where the law became more meaningful and more profound and more internalized by all of us. But even before COVID, that whole post-war international order was already breaking down. It was breaking down because the United States was exhausted for multiple reasons, including self-inflicted wounds of unnecessary wars. It was exhausted, the United States was exhausted because of our own political dysfunctions. There was a natural rebalancing of the world. The US post-war planners could have had a strategy of keeping other countries down, but instead there was a strategy of, certainly at least for allied countries, building them up. There is a rise of countries that didn't necessarily fully buy in to the traditional concept of the post-war liberal international order, particularly, but not exclusively, China. And we saw all of these new technologies that were decentralizing power. And with the rate of technological change accelerating, it wasn't that one country like the United States had a technological advantage that would last for decades. What we're seeing is a transfer of knowledge on a really exciting and positive scale. But what it means is that traditional concentrations of power are less concentrated, are disaggregated. And so the idea of any one country or even one institution being able to keep all of the pieces together was more and more difficult. And the way I even before this, I like to use a quote by Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist theorist, which is, "The old world is dying, the new world has not yet emerged, and in the twilight rise up monsters." So the post-war international system was already falling apart. We didn't know what was going to replace it. As a matter of fact, just coincidentally, in September of 2018, I was invited, and Tommy will like this, to speak at a conference in Wuhan on China's maritime borders.
Okay.
And I said, are you sure you want me? Because I imagine what I'm going to say you're not going to like. And they promised me, and I said that I wouldn't be censored. Anyway, I got there to give my talk. Of course, that morning, I had all these people in the guest house, and they said, "Your talk has been canceled." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, we understand what you are going to say, and we're not comfortable with it." And I said, "All right, well, I'll just come anyway." And I went there, and then at the end of the day, they were having a Q&A, and I just raised my hand. I think somebody didn't know not to give me the microphone, and they gave me a microphone, and I gave a speech about how I'm originally from Kansas City, and my parents in Kansas City in central United States are actually watching right now. And I'm from the hometown of Harry Truman. And Harry Truman helped build this post-war international order that we live in. But what I see is, on one hand, I see China, if we see this as kind of like a foundation of a building, I see China hacking away on one side, and I see my own country, the United States under President Trump, hacking away on the other side. And if everybody is hacking away at the foundations, this building is going to fall. And that certainly was my belief early this year when we started to get the first evidence of how serious the COVID pandemic is and was. And on the morning of March 17th, I was scheduled to give a talk for Singularity University on whether the tools of the genetics revolution were a match for the pandemic. But that morning I woke up and I decided, that's not the most important topic. The real question that we have to ask ourselves is, why weren't we prepared for this pandemic? When we ask that question, it leads us to the question, why weren't we prepared for the broader category of pandemics? And that leads us to the even broader question of, why can't we solve pretty much any of the big shared existential global challenges that we face as humans. And that was why, I mean, just seeing the big picture in this small story of the pandemic, and it explained why we didn't have the WHO that we needed. It explained why we didn't have the international systems for collaboration. And it explained why that even if we had solved the problem of this pandemic, we could have been having the exact same conversation because there were nuclear detonations in major capitals, or because the ocean ecosystem collapsed because of mismanagement and greed. And in that talk on the 17th, what I said was, unless we fix this bigger problem, we're just going to be continually jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. But we have to identify what the problem is. And as I saw it then and see it now, the problem is there is a mismatch between shared global problems and the predominantly, but not exclusively, national way we've organized ourselves to address them. And unless we solve that bigger problem, we're not going to be, who knows whether we'll even survive as a species. We're going to compete ourselves to death. And the way that I at least articulated in that talk was, we have to build a constituency representing our democratic aspirations as humans sharing the same planet. We have that. The way we drive change on a national level is by organizing ourselves, and we create pressure groups. Sometimes we call them political parties, sometimes we call them social movements. We don't have that on a global level. On a global level, we have rock concerts where people listen to music and wave their iPhones back and forth. And unless our common interests as humans sharing the same planet has a relevant seat at the table of global power and decision making, we're just going to be asking, we humans are just going to be asking for handouts, while the people we have hired to represent us are doing the exact job we've hired them to do, which is to represent our national interests. And if we want to change that, we've got to change it ourselves. It's not 1941 where the strategy is, I just support Franklin Roosevelt. We don't have a Franklin Roosevelt. We have to divide up that job and do it ourselves. So that talk went viral. 2 nights later, I stayed up all night and I drafted what I then called a Declaration of Global Interdependence. I put that out on my website and that went viral. And I called a global meeting. And on April 1st, we had 130 people from 25 countries come together. And I said just what I've told everybody here this morning. I said, we've got to do something about it. So we broke into 8 different working groups. We redrafted the Declaration of Interdependence. And 35 days later, we launched our organization, OneShared.World. The declaration is now in 18 different languages, including Zulu, Swahili, Xhosa, Tibetan, Armenian, simplified and traditional Chinese, and many others. We're a community of people in 110 countries and growing. But what we're really trying to do is to create a global constituency representing our common humanity. And there are lots of people, and they're all reaching out to me now, who are the people who for years have been saying, well, we need a global world government, global parliament. I don't think we're ready for that. But certainly what we need is we need every company, every country, every international organization, every civil society organization to recognize that in addition to their commitment to the people within their smaller constituency, they also have a responsibility to represent our common interests as humans. And there's some really basic things that we can do right now that we are advocating for. First, we know that this pandemic is harming the most vulnerable people. And we know that the vulnerable people are not them, they are us, because our fate and our health and well-being are interconnected, and that's what the virus is showing us. So one thing that we have done is we've launched a campaign calling on, working with lots of other organizations and governments, calling on G20 leaders to commit in their communique of the Riyadh summit this November that every human being on Earth should have access to safe water, basic sanitation and hygiene, and essential pandemic preparedness by 2030. These are fully aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but so far we've seen this kind of intervention as charity. And what we're seeing is this isn't charity. This is an investment in our collective well-being in this time of crisis. The second thing that we're doing is we're calling on the United Nations to establish, whatever the right name is, a Department of Existential Threats. We know what the lists are of these big common challenges that we face. It's climate change, ecosystem destruction, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, global systemic poverty and inequality. And we need to have one entity that is evaluating where we are, what needs to be done, and bringing not just countries, civil society organizations, academics, learning institutions together to say, what do we need to do to be prepared? And certainly there's a cost associated with this kind of investment. But as we're seeing now, it is nothing compared to the costs associated with not being prepared and not being able to respond. And again, if it's not the pandemic this time, it'll be some kind of ecosystem destruction next time. There are so many different issues. We have to think systemically about how we solve these systemic problems. If we're only thinking episodically, we'll fix one, but not the other. And the other thing that we are calling on is for every organization in the world, every government, political party, civil society group, business, to change their mission or platform to include a clause signifying that they recognize that the mutual responsibilities of interdependence. And again, it's not charity, it's survival. Our species has gone very rapidly from being a local band of different humans to being this global species. And our politics haven't caught up with our reach. And we have to change that. And the way that we're going to change that has to be at all levels. It has to be top down, but it must be bottom up. What we really need is a spiritual revolution, not to change people into something that we aren't, but to recognize that in our global community, our fate, our health, our well-being are tied to each other. We can't just look at 3 billion people living in abject poverty and say, well, that's too bad for them. We have to see us in them. But to do that, we have to build that awareness. We have to build that new reality in the way that we see the world, the way that we see us and them. Because when future historians look back and they try to assess different developments over the past hundreds of years, when they think of 1648, they'll say, all right, the key word was sovereignty. And when they think of 1945, they'll say the key word was international. And when I hope they look back at 2020, I hope the key words are that 2020 was the year when we finally recognized the mutual responsibilities of our deep interdependence. So let me stop there and hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Very inspiring talk, Jamie. So maybe I begin the Q&A session by asking you the first couple of questions. My first question. We live in a world of sovereign states, and this is not going to go away, you know. I see a disconnect, however, between the world which is becoming more and more interdependent and interconnected, and a world which is gravitating to a nationalism rather than internationalism. And apart from your own country, I see many countries in the world have elected leaders which emphasize nationalism rather than interdependent. How do you explain this disconnect between the nature of the world we're living in and the national politics
Yeah, it's such an essential question, Tommy. And I think that both of those are very natural human responses to fear. And so certainly in moments of fear, there's a sense, well, I'm going to gravitate toward my group. And we see leaders like President Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil and many others who recognize that that is a political opportunity. And it is. And at these moments of fear, there are opportunities to say, well, maybe we can do something different. And this is the reason why I often say that this year is equivalent, as I see it, to 1918, is in 1918, at the end of the First World War, there was this same kind of moment. I mean, there was a level of idealism, maybe even beyond what I've articulated today of Woodrow Wilson and the 14 points. And there were lots of people who later assumed power, Hitler, Mussolini, and others, who recognized that this was a real opportunity to take advantage of people's fears. And both of them knew that these same technologies, like radio, could be used to organize people. It wasn't coincidence that Hitler and Roosevelt, who were born with and died within months of each other, both understood the power of radio. Hitler used it for propaganda. Roosevelt used it for fireside chats to bring the country together. And that's why what I've said, this is not any kind of guarantee. As a matter of fact, if I had to put odds on one side or the other, I think that fear is a very, very powerful force. And we haven't lived in a world for 70 plus years where we didn't have an America that was playing this special role. We don't know what that world looks like. And I just want to read for you. This is a quote from Donald Trump at the UN General Assembly last year. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations. Yeah. And I'm not against sovereign and independent nations. I'm not even against patriotism. Yeah. But if that's the only story we tell, we're going to do it.
Thank you, Jamie. I have a second question. Your government has tried to demonize WHO. But as you explained in your talk, WHO is indispensable to the health of the people of the world. And many of the shortcomings of WHO are the results of the actions of member states. For example, WHO is not properly funded and it has to depend on voluntary contribution. This is not the right thing to do, you know? So my question then is, are member states learning the right lesson from this crisis, and will they do the right thing for WHO, or is this a futile mission?
So, as I said, as always, Tommy, I completely agree with you. We need the WHO. The WHO is now more than essential than ever. But if we don't learn the lessons of what went wrong, we're really in trouble. And certainly, I've been very, very vocal criticizing my own government here in the United States. And actually, I had a piece in Newsweek saying the title was "Defunding the WHO in the Middle of a Pandemic is Lunacy." Yeah. And I'll post that. Yeah. But it's not just the United States. Certainly, President Trump is trying to point fingers at the WHO to avoid the blame for his own administration. As I said in my remarks, that doesn't mean that the WHO was perfect, but the fault of the WHO is us. And if we don't learn that lesson, and even China, I mean, China has done a lot of grandstanding with the WHO. Taiwan deserves to be a member of the World Health Assembly because the pandemic the virus is not following our own political divisions. It goes where it goes. And when we're talking about health, we have to just stop playing politics. So we need to articulate a different future for the WHO. I'm hopeful that there can be political changes around the world of people and leaders who will recognize that if we don't come together, we're going to compete ourselves to death.
Thank you. Okay, my final question. I compliment you for being the founder and chairman of this people's movement, OneShared.World. I think, as you say correctly, we need change at the top, but we also need change at the people's level. So I commend you for creating this people's movement in every country in the world. We need a constituency in each of our country for the narrative that we live in an interdependent world. And we shouldn't think only of our national interests. We should also think of ASEAN's interests. We should think of the world's interests, you know? So I commend you, Jamie, for having done this, and I wish you success. Now I turn to the questions. Huh?
What I would say is first, thank you so much for your kind words. Second, I hope that everybody, and I'll post it in the chat, but I hope everyone will go to OneShared.World and sign the Pledge of Interdependence. And we're now starting national chapters. So India will be our first chapter, and in Philippines. But I'd love for us to have a chapter in Singapore. But we really see this as a community of co-creators and people coming together.
Thank you, Jamie. Okay, I go to the question. We have 9 questions. Okay, so the first question, Jamie, is about vaccine nationalism. How do we bring about the international community to make the vaccine an international public good and make it available to all?
Yeah, I think vaccine nationalism, as WHO, as Dr. Tedros has said, it's an extreme danger. And yet we have different countries that are investing a lot in those vaccines and companies that are also investing. And so there are some people who have said we should just jettison capitalism and have everything be run by governments. I don't think that's the right answer. There's so much innovation in the private sector. But I also feel that we need to have whatever the equivalent is for these vaccines of compulsory licensing, because once we have a vaccine that works, we need to do everything we can to distribute access. And I think that we need to be investing in that now. We need to be, and certainly the Gates Foundations and others are doing that. We need to be creating manufacturing infrastructure in the developing world. And we need to recognize that a lot of these innovations aren't coming from nowhere, that a lot of the work that's coming out of either countries or companies is actually government-funded basic science that eventually translates into specific applications. And so vaccine nationalism is a threat, but we can't be simplistic in how we counter it. And even if that we, the global community, need to actually compensate companies for innovation, we should do it, but do it up front and not just wait. But I think on this issue of vaccines, this is going to be a bumpy road. I mean, there's never been a coronavirus vaccine in human history. There's never been a safe DNA or RNA vaccine for humans in human history. So I hope we have a vaccine soon, but it could be more complicated.
Okay, thank you. Another question related to vaccine. The University of Oxford is in the front line of developing a vaccine. The government of Russia has announced that it has an effective vaccine which is in the marketplace. Can you share some wisdom on how to evaluate these claims, and when is it safe for governments to acquire these vaccine and to give them to the people? Yeah.
So I'll do Russia first. Before Russia, the WHO keeps a registry of phase 3 trials of vaccines for COVID. There wasn't a single Russian company who was in a phase 3 trial. So the Russian vaccine has moved very, very quickly. If it works, that will be great. But I think we should be very, very cautious. I mean, vaccines are systemic changes to complex human biologies. And so I would be delighted if it works. And I'm cautious about that. The Oxford vaccine is, so there are different approaches to the vaccines. One are the kind of traditional attenuated virus vaccine like the polio. The other is Trojan horse, a vaccine where you have another virus and you change the package that that virus is carrying, and that's what the Oxford vaccine is. And then there are these RNA vaccines like Moderna here in the United States are developing.
Right.
And so these are, I think we have to try all of these different approaches, and we still don't know which are going to work, but it's just a huge priority to keep pushing forward on multiple fronts.
Yeah. Okay. The next question is about your proposal that the UN should set up a special unit to look at all these existential threats to the world. So there are two related questions. Do we need a special unit? Isn't this the responsibility of the Secretary General? And the related question, which is a very important one, is we live in a world of sovereign states. So even if you have a special unit, are the member states going to live up to their collective responsibility, or will they be looking after their own individuals' sovereign interests?
Yeah, it's two great questions. For first, it is the responsibility of the Secretary General, but as in any executive, the Secretary General works through agencies. And once something is deemed important enough in all governments, we create an agency so that we can concentrate our efforts in doing that. The second question is the kind of the core question that I raised in my talk is, can we not overcome, but balance our world of sovereign states? And I think that is a battle that we're going to fight. That's why we've created OneShared.World, so that when we do that, we at least, that there is on the other side of the table, there's a group of people, an empowered constituency saying, hey, that's not good enough. It's not good enough that our states are going to compete with each other when we are the victims. But that's why we need to organize ourselves to make that happen. Otherwise, it's people at think tanks writing papers, and sometimes those happen, but we need to demand the change that we need to survive.
Thank you. The next question is about the role of regional organizations. You agree with the question that regional organizations like ASEAN, the European Union, can play an important role in your vision, of promoting interdependence and cooperation between and among states?
Absolutely, they're essential, and we need multi-layers. There are some things that actually states do a very good job at, and there are certain things that can happen on a regional level. We just need multiple levels, but at every level, every organization needs to be mindful of its narrower interests and our collective broader interests.
Okay, this is an interesting question. It's about policy making, the role of politicians versus the role of medical experts. I guess in many countries, they work in unison. If you look at Singapore, the government respects science, it accepts expert advice, but this is not the case in all countries. But I guess there's no solution to this problem, Jamie, is there?
Well, there's a cultural solution, and we, in the past, in the United States, we've had that culture. So traditionally, for example, when there was a pandemic, the CDC in the United States would have been leading the response. And we've had, unfortunately, sadly, here in the United States, a politicization of science, a politicization of what even people consider to be a fact or not a fact. That's a cultural issue. And I think that the way you have it in Singapore, where the scientists and the politicians work together, that's what we need.
I think, Jimmy, I must confess to you that as somebody who's been studying your country for 50 years, we are constantly astonished by what we are seeing. How can the world's #1 scientific power produce so many citizens who are skeptical about science?
Yeah,
it's a complete puzzle to us,
It's a really great question, and I know, Tommy, I know how much respect you have for the United States. As I said before, I'm the son of a refugee. Everything that I have in life is because of the role the United States played winning the war and building this, helping to build this world. But these are failures. And what we need to recognize is that we just need to be really honest about these failures. And certainly in the United States, we've had throwaway people where people were just okay that big chunks of the population didn't have access to all sorts of things, including quality education. And that division was mirrored in the world where, as I've said before, we have 3 billion people living in abject poverty. And that is, I think, what we need to recognize is that we're all in this together and our fates are intertwined. And so certainly the United States there's a lot of wonderful things and there's a lot of heartbreak.
Next question may be the last. It's a very good one. You had said one of the problems is that WHO is not mandated to have a global surveillance system, you know? So how do we, is this on the agenda, WHO? Can we get member states to embrace this proposal to strengthen WHO post-COVID crisis, to mandate them to have this capacity?
I certainly hope that we can. I certainly believe that we must, but the only way that it's actually going to happen is if we make that happen. And certainly, and China is really the worst. I mean, the United States, I'm very open with my criticism of China, but China should not have blocked those investigators on day one. If this outbreak had happened in Congo and the government had tried to keep WHO investigators out, this would have gone to the Security Council in 5 minutes. So we have a big power problem. And part of the problem is the United States, part of the problem is China. And these are the problems that we need to fix. And we need to be honest about what they are. And there's a lot of criticism to go around, and there's a feeling, and I know that in ASEAN, there's the ASEAN way and things are very gentle. But I just think that that there's some really big things that are wrong in our world. We need to be honest about what they are, not with any kind of animosity, but to say, well, how do we fix it? Because everybody is suffering from this avoidable pandemic, and everybody will benefit from actually solving the problem.
Thank you, Jamie. Jamie, I've just got a new question, and then maybe this is a way to round up this discussion. So this lady says that nationalism and globalism or internationalism are not mutually exclusive. So the question to you is, shouldn't our focus be to promote a better integration of these two paradigms?
Yeah, I agree. And I think
I also agree.
Yeah, I mean, because it's good to love your country and your community and your family and your world. And it's not an either or, but how do we bring all of those pieces together and find the right balance?
Yeah. So I'm very happy to tell you, Jamie, that from the many questions I've received, I think there's support for your OneShared.World People's Movement for Interdependence. So I'm confident that your wish to have a Singapore chapter will come true.
Great.
So I want to turn now to Kenyon. Kenyon, any final words from you?
Thank you, Tommy. Actually, my idea is to let Jamie has 2 minutes of wrap up from what he got through the Q&A segment.
Good.
And maybe give us some conclusion.
Okay, good.
Especially, we are still looking to people in the United States and the industrialized world to find a good idea going forward. What we see so far is this array in the developed economies, and we are just scratching our head, and we do not know what can be done among the emerging economies and the less developed economies. So from your experience, Jamie, with OneShared.World, is there any striking new vision which maybe in the last 2 minutes you can just summarize for us? Thank you, Jamie.
Yeah, so first, thank you so much to RSIS and Professor Kumar Ramakrishnan and Ambassador Professor Tommy Ko and Kenyon. It's really just been a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. And just to summarize kind of my core point as the takeaway is, it's just that our world is not organized in the right way to solve the biggest problems that we have. And that if we keep trying to solve these problems piecemeal, without the right institution, without institutions, without the right way of thinking comprehensively and collectively about problems, we may do a little better here and there. We certainly made a little bit of progress on climate change, not enough to slow climate change. We made a little bit of progress on slowing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, not enough to solve the problem. We're now, and it's clear in Tommy's questions, we may do a little bit to solve a piece of the problem of pandemics, but we're entering, and I hope everyone will read my book, Hacking Darwin, to learn more about this, but we're entering the age of synthetic biology. And whatever the origins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, not many people are saying it's a genetically engineered virus. 5 years from now, we could easily have a virus, a respiratory virus, that's much more deadly than this. That is the product of synthetic biology. When we talk about a novel virus, our species has never encountered it. We haven't encountered much of anything in the synthetic biology world. So our world is getting a lot more complicated. And if we don't recognize that we need to reorganize ourselves, we're really going to be in trouble. I talked about 1648. It took the 30 Years' War to force people to think differently. In 1945, it took World War II. This pandemic may not be big enough to knock us into a new reality. But if we don't have the courage to think differently, we're really entering into a dangerous place. And so my message is one of hope, but it's hope that requires action. It's not a passive hope, it's an active hope. And that means it's all of our jobs to help build that better world.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Tommy. Maybe you want to wrap up, Tommy?
No, I think it's, I thank Jamie for coming to us with a very inspiring message that we shouldn't just give up and say, well, what can we do? Human beings are selfish by nature. And I thank him for organizing this global movement of people in all our countries to disseminate, to mobilize public opinion, to say, yes, we can love our country, nothing wrong with nationalism, but we also need a new gospel of interdependence and of internationalism. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Tommy.